Shall we bow our heads for prayer? Father in heaven, as we open up your holy book, we realize more than ever that we need the aid of your Holy Spirit. So we ask that you will come and be present with us through that Spirit who gave us the Word. Help us to understand and to receive what you have for us. Help us to have greater admiration for you. We pray in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. In our lecture for this moment, we are going to speak about God's heavenly counsel. And we want to begin our study in the book of Job, chapter 38, and I'm going to focus especially on verse 7. But I want to give you a little bit about a background about Job before we read this verse and the verses that surround it. You know the story of Job. Basically, chapter 1 and 2 tells us that Job lost everything that he had. The only thing that he didn't lose was his life. He even lost his health. Servants. His wife turned against him. His friends turned against him. He lost servants. He lost all of his animals. He lost all of his properties. He just, in a matter of minutes, he lost everything that he had. That's the first two chapters. Beginning in chapter 3, Job starts complaining to God. And he starts asking God to explain the reason why he's going through this period of crisis. He says to God, I was a family man. I offered sacrifices for my children. I used my riches to benefit the poor. I clothed the naked. I blessed humanity. I consecrated my life to you. So why is this happening to me? Please explain. But from chapter 3 to chapter 37, God's only answer is absolute silence. And this frustrates Job. And so all throughout these chapters, chapter 3 to chapter 37, Job is crying out to God for God to explain his suffering. And God says nothing to Job. Finally, in chapter 38, God is going to tell Job, Job, now I'm going to ask the questions and you answer me. Let's read Job 38, beginning with verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. God is saying it's my turn to ask questions. Notice verse 4. Where wast thou when I laid the foundation of the earth? Declare it, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? What is being described in these verses? There's no doubt that what is being described is creation. Now I want you to notice verse 7. This is the key verse in this whole passage. It says in verse 7 that when God did all of these things, he laid the foundations of the earth, he laid the measures, he laid the foundations and the cornerstone. It tells us in verse 7 that something happened when God did that. This is pre-creation, or at the moment of creation at least. It says, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Did you notice that when God created this world, when Jesus created this world, there were two groups that celebrated God's work? One group is called the stars of heaven, and the other group is called the sons of God. Now, I don't think we have to look too far in the Bible to understand who the morning stars were. Because in Revelation chapter 12, for example, we find that when the devil fell from heaven, he drew a third of the stars from heaven with him. And it's explained there that the angels of Satan were cast to the earth with him. So stars, the morning stars, represent angels. So you'll notice that the angels pre-existed creation because they sang at creation. But what about this group which is described as the sons of God? Who are these sons of God? Well, I believe the best answer to that question would be to let Job himself tell us who the sons of God are. Do you know that in 2 other places in his book, he mentions the sons of God? Let's go in our Bibles to Job chapter 1, and I want to read quickly through verses 1 all the way down to verse 7. There was a certain man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, probably the birthday, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. Now verses 6 and 7 are the key verses. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Question: do the sons of God come all the time to present themselves before the Lord? Do they live in the presence of the Lord? Not according to this. It says that they came on a certain occasion to present themselves before the Lord, which means that they do not dwell where the Lord is, because they came. And so it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And now notice, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? In other words, where do you come from? And notice the answer. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Did you notice that Satan came to this meeting among the sons of God, it says? We have the impression, the strong impression, that Satan claimed to have a right to belong to this group known as the sons of God. He came among them. And the interesting thing is that the story describes Satan coming from a planet Earth. Now, I don't think that we have to be too intelligent to figure out that if Satan comes among this group called the sons of God to present himself before God, and he comes from a planet, it must mean that the other sons of God that belong to the same group most likely also came from planets. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, the first meeting ended, and Job loses everything he has, except God did not let the devil touch Job. So now there's another meeting that takes place. Notice Job chapter 2 and verses 1 and 2. Job chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Now notice carefully. Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Now this is very important. What did the sons of God do? They came to present themselves before the Lord. By the way, would this mean that they went back to wherever they lived after the first meeting? See, it's so simple. They must have gone back to where they lived, because it says that they came on another day to present themselves before the Lord, which means that they came to the first meeting, they went back to where they lived, and then they came back to the second meeting. They don't live in the presence of God. And notice once again in chapter 2 and verse 2, and the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. So we find that the sons of God do not permanently dwell in the presence of God. We find that God, off and on, we don't know how frequently, calls the sons of God into his presence for a meeting. And we discover that Satan, who claims the right to be among the sons of God, comes from a planet, planet Earth, which would lead us to assume that the other sons of God, which belong to that group, must also come from planets. Now, we have another description of a heavenly council like this in the Old Testament. And I really don't know whether I should go into it because our time is so limited for these presentations. But I would like to invite you, I'll just give you the reference. 2 Chronicles chapter 18 and verses 18 to 21. It's a rather long passage, but I want you to read that passage, and you'll notice that once again you have the heavenly council convening in heaven. All of the heavenly hosts are around God's throne. And God says to all of the heavenly hosts, who is willing to go and persuade Ahab, King Ahab, to go to battle against the Syrians so he gets killed in battle? And you'll notice that the heavenly council could not agree on how it would be done. It says that one said one thing and the other said another thing. And suddenly a spirit appears into the presence of the Lord, and he says, I'll entice Ahab to go fight against the Syrians so that they kill him. And the Lord says, and how are you going to do it? He says, well, I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And they will tell Ahab to go, knowing full well that he's going to be killed. Now let me ask you, does God use lying as a method to accomplish his purposes? Do the loyal, faithful angels use lying? They most certainly don't. So who was this spirit that was present up there next to God's throne who says, I'll go down there and I'll lead the prophets to tell him to go to battle, full well knowing that he's going to be killed? It must have been Satan. What I want you to notice is that there is deliberation in the heavenly council concerning earthly events. Now we need to ask a very urgent question, and it's this. What was Satan doing in that meeting in the book of Job and in the meeting in 2 Chronicles chapter 18? What was Satan doing representing planet Earth in that heavenly meeting? Well, we've read this text in our first two lectures. Luke chapter 4, verses 5 through 7, where the devil takes Jesus up to a very high mountain, and he shows him all of the kingdoms of the world. And he says to Jesus, all of these kingdoms and their power I will give you, because they have been delivered unto me, and to whomever I wish, I give them. Who delivered this earth to Satan? It was Adam. The reason why Satan went to that meeting in heaven, or went to those meetings in heaven representing planet Earth, is because Satan had taken over the representative role over this earth. He had sat on the throne where Adam was, and he claimed dominion over this territory. In other words, the devil usurped or took away the position of Adam. Now we need to study a few things about Adam. It's very interesting. In order to understand God's heavenly counsel, we must take a look at Adam and God's original plan for him. I'm not talking about Adam after he sinned. I'm talking about Adam as God planned originally for him. Now turn with me to Luke chapter 3 and verse 23. Luke chapter 3 and verse 23. Here we find a description of the genealogy of Christ. And I'm going to read the beginning of his genealogy, and then I'm going to read the end of his genealogy. It says there in Luke chapter 3 and verse 23, And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli, and so on, the son of so-and-so, and the son of so-and-so. And now I want you to notice verse 38, the conclusion of this genealogy of Christ. It says, which was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam, which was the son of God. What is Adam called? Adam is called the son of God. By the way, was Adam the son of God in a special sense, in a different sense than we are? Of course he was. Because we are technically not sons of God, we are sons of Adam, sons and daughters of Adam. There is only one who could say that he came out of the hands of the Creator, and that was Adam, and of course Eve, that was taken from Adam. In other words, in the strictest sense of the word, the only one who can be called the Son of God is Adam. And you'll notice here that Adam is called the Son of God. Does that ring a bell when you look at the book of Job? Very interesting. Who was the original Son of God from planet Earth? It was Adam. Allow me to read you a statement that we find in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 45. Ellen White caught this point. She says, the genealogy of our race, as given by inspiration, traces its origin not to a line of developing germs, mollusks, and quadrupeds, but to the great Creator. Though formed from the dust, Adam was the Son of God. And by the way, she puts the expression, the Son of God, in quotation marks. She's quoting Luke 3:38. She says, he was placed as God's representative over the lower orders of being. In other words, clearly we find Adam being called the Son of God. Now there's some other interesting details about God's original description and plan for Adam. Did you know, for example, that Adam was crowned in the Garden of Eden? Notice what we find in Psalm 8, which we've read in a previous lecture, Psalm 8 and verses 3 through 5. Here it speaks about the crowning of Adam. Psalm 8, and once again, verses 3 to 5. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. What is man, that is Adam, that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast, now what's the next word? Hast what? Hast what? Hast crowned him with glory and honor. Was Adam crowned in the Garden of Eden? He most certainly was. Now, who is crowned? A king. Allow me once again to read a statement that we find in God's Amazing Grace, that devotional book by Ellen White, page 40. She also caught this point that we notice from Scripture, from Psalm 8. She says, Adam was crowned king in Eden. Did you notice that? Adam was crowned king in Eden. To him was given dominion over every living thing that God had created. The Lord blessed Adam and Eve with intelligence such as he had not given to any other creature. And now notice, he made Adam the rightful sovereign over all the works of his hands. Who was the rightful sovereign? Adam. Who was the king of this planet? Once again, it was Adam. So we find Adam, the Son of God, crowned to be king. And of course, as a king, he represented planet Earth. Once again, I want to read a statement that we find in the devotional book, The Faith I Live By. It's also, by the way, found in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 48. This is what she says. The Sabbath was committed to Adam. the father and representative of the whole human family. What was Adam? He was the father and representative of the whole human family. In other words, Adam was the representative, the legitimate representative of planet Earth. Are you starting to catch an interesting picture? The Son of God, crowned to be king. The realm of his dominion, everything relating to the earth. The birds of the air, the fish of the waters, and the animals that walked upon the land, all were the sphere of his dominion. And he is the father and representative of planet Earth. Now let me ask you, how was Adam garbed? How was he clothed originally before sin? Actually, he was covered with a robe of light, like the garments that God wears. Do you know when the Bible speaks about angels being clothed in white linen and God the Father being clothed in white linen? The white linen of the angels and of God is really a garment of light. Do you remember the woman of Revelation chapter 12? It says, representing the true church, she's clothed with what? With the sun. And so the garments are garments of light. But what happened when Adam and Eve sinned? What happened with the garments of light? They went away and they saw that they were naked. And so they took fig leaves to cover themselves. But originally they were robed in white garments. Now, allow me to read you once again a statement. This is from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 45. See, we go to Scripture and then we read the spirit of prophecy. Ellen White says this: the sinless pair wore no artificial garments. They were clothed with a covering of light and glory, such as the angels wear. Did you catch that? So the angels don't have artificial garments made out of linen or satin or whatever you want to call the best materials. No, they're robed in light. She continues saying, so long as they lived in obedience to God, this robe of light continued to enshroud them. So we find Adam and also Eve garbed with garments of light. Let's summarize what we've studied. First of all, Adam is the Son of God, as he was originally created. Secondly, we find Adam crowned. Third, we find that the realm of his dominion is everything connected with planet Earth. In the fourth place, he's the father and representative of planet Earth. And he is robed with garments of light. And of course, if he was representative of planet Earth, that means that if God ever called a meeting, who would go representing planet Earth? Adam. Who represents the United States of America? If there's a meeting, like the G7 meeting, famously called, who goes representing our country? It is the President of the United States. Because he is, so to speak, the ruler. He's not a king. He's democratically elected, but he's still the ruler. And so he represents the United States. In the same way, Adam was ruler over the earth, and he represented this world. But something terrible happened, and that is that Adam, as we've noticed in Luke chapter 4, and also by the fact that Jesus calls Satan the prince of this world, Adam lost his throne. He abdicated his throne, and Satan sat on the throne and claimed the earth. That's why when he went to that heavenly meeting, he says, I've been roaming over the earth, patrolling and supervising my territory, is what he's saying. And he comes among the sons of God. Now, if the original son of God was Adam, a creature from a planet, who must the other sons of God be? Is it just possible that they are, so to speak, atoms from other planets or from other worlds? I believe so. Now let's go to the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4, and let's examine a few of the things that we studied in our previous lecture. Revelation chapter 4, And I want to begin at verse 2. Door is open in heaven. John is invited to go through the door. And when he goes into the door, he sees there a throne. Let's read about it. It says, "And immediately I was in the Spirit. And behold, a throne was set in heaven. And one sat on the throne." How many were seated on the throne? One. Why only one? We studied this in our previous lecture. The reason why there's only one is because the angels have all left to pick up Jesus to bring him back to heaven. And that takes place in Revelation chapter 5. And so we find this throne where God the Father is seated. And now I want you to notice verse 4. And notice the details. And round about the throne were 24 thrones. And upon the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting. What position are the elders in? They are sitting. What are they sitting on? Thrones. Who sits on thrones? Kings. Unless you don't believe that these are kings, let's continue reading. It says, "And round about the throne were 24 thrones, and upon the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting," and now notice this, "clothed in white raiment." What is the white raiment? Garments of what? Of light. And notice, it says, "And they had on their heads," what? They had on their heads crowns of gold. Who wears crowns? Kings. Now there are several interesting details in this verse. We know that these are not angels. We're going to notice this a little bit later more clearly. These are not angels. Because in Scripture, angels are not portrayed as sitting. They are always in movement, fulfilling the missions of God. They're ministering spirits. They don't have any sphere of rulership. And furthermore, in Scripture itself, there is no reference, as far as I've been able to find, to angels having crowns. So we find here that these beings are kings. They're seated on thrones. They must be rulers somewhere. They're garbed in white garments. And by the way, we also find in Revelation chapter 4 that they are creatures. Notice Revelation chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. It says in verse 9, "And when these living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him that sat upon the throne, and worship him that liveth forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created." They are worshiping the one on the throne as the creator, which means that they must be what? They must be creatures. So you have creatures that are crowned, creatures that sit upon thrones, creatures that are garbed in white garments. And they've come to this meeting place where everything is being prepared for the arrival of whom? For the arrival of Jesus Christ. By the way, we noticed in our previous lecture that also in the midst of the throne there were 4 living beings, which we identified as what? As seraphim. Angels, commanding angels with 6 wings. And by the way, if you read Ezekiel 10 and 11, you'll discover that the cherubim are described in very similar terminology. In other words, present there, awaiting the arrival of Christ, were cherubim and seraphim. And then, of course, in chapter 5, and you remember that in chapter 4, Jesus is missing, right? He's not sitting on the throne. In chapter 4, are the angels there? The angels aren't there. They're missing. And so you say in chapter 4, where is Jesus? Where are the angels? And the fact is that the one on the throne is praised because he's the creator. There's no reference to redemption. But when you get to chapter 5, there are clear references to redemption. Jesus appears. And all of the angelic host also appears along with Jesus, because in chapter 5, Jesus arrives in heaven. Now go with me to chapter 5 and verse 5. And one of the elders saith unto me, Weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed. Prevailed over whom? Who did he prevail over? He prevailed over Satan. Hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 living creatures, and in the midst of the elders, stood a lamb as it had been slain. What did it cost this lamb in order to overcome Satan? Was he scarred? Yes, he was. It says, a lamb as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. And he came and took the book out of the right hand of him that sat upon the throne. So now in chapter 5, Jesus arrives. And then if you go to verse 11, you find all of the angelic host around the throne. And they're singing honor and glory, not only to the one seated on the throne, to the Creator, but they're singing honor and glory and praise to Jesus Christ, because he is the Redeemer. Are you catching the picture? And present there are the 24 elders. Now, there's another person missing in the story of Revelation 4 and 5. If this is the heavenly council, where at certain times the sons of God, who are rulers and are crowned and are garbed in white and are sons of God, and they're invited to come on special occasions to heaven, and among those to those meetings came also Satan, whom would we expect to come to this meeting that takes place in Revelation chapter 4 and 5? You would say, well, if the 24 elders are the representatives of the worlds, which seems to be the case as you look at the comparison between Job and Revelation chapter 4 and 5, you would say you would expect Satan to be there. But the fact is that Satan is missing in the story of Revelation 4 and 5. Do you know why? Because at the cross of Calvary, he was overcome. Go with me to John chapter 12, and let's notice this. John chapter 12. See, it all fits together. John chapter 12 and verses 31 to 33. This is just a couple of days before the death of Christ. And it says there in John chapter 12 and verse 31, the following. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. What does Jesus say? The prince, which can also be translated ruler, the ruler of this world is going to be what? Cast out. Cast out from where? This is not talking about the original casting out of Satan from heaven. This is another casting out. Do you know that the devil was cast out of heaven at the cross? He was cast out of heaven as the representative of this world. Notice how Jesus did it. Verse 32. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. This he said, signifying what death he should die. So what is it that cast out Satan from heaven according to Jesus? It was going to be his what? His death on the cross. When Jesus says, it is finished to his Father, he's also saying, he is finished. Because his head was crushed. And Satan no longer represents planet Earth. Now Jesus ascends to heaven, and the human race has a new representative. That's the reason why the New Testament calls Jesus the last Adam. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 45, Jesus is called the last Adam because Jesus came to recover that which Adam lost. And he did that. Now I'd like to read some statements here. These statements come from several sources. The first is in the Gospel Herald, March 1, 1901. Notice what Ellen White says. She caught this point, that no longer could Satan go representing this world. When the sons of God gather in heaven, Satan can't go there anymore, because Jesus has taken the place of Satan. It says there, Christ was to suffer in our behalf, standing at the head of humanity as representative of the race. What was Jesus going to do? He was going to be at the head of humanity as the representative of the race. He was to work out the character which every follower of his is to work out, through the provision which he has made, his infinite sacrifice, his life and death on earth. So who is the new head and representative of planet Earth? It is the second Adam, Jesus. Signs of the Times, January 16, 1896. We find these words: Jesus humbled himself, clothing his divinity with humanity, in order that he might stand as the head and representative of the human family, and by both precept and example condemn sin in the flesh and give the lie to Satan's charges. So let me ask you, who is the new king of planet Earth? Who is the new representative of planet Earth in the heavenly council? It is none less than Jesus Christ. Satan, the prince of this world, was cast down at the cross of Calvary. Now whenever there are meetings in heaven, Jesus represents this earth. He represents this planet. So who are the 24 elders of Revelation chapter 4? I have no doubts in my mind that by the characteristics that we've studied, that the 24 elders represent the representatives of the unfallen worlds. They're crowned because they're kings of their planets. They sit on thrones because they are kings. They are garbed in white, just like Adam was when he was created originally. In other words, they are the rulers of the worlds who were invited to the inauguration of Jesus upon his return to heaven. Now, I know that somebody's saying, well, wait a minute, Pastor Bohr. You're passing over a problem. And so we need to solve this problem. The problem is in Revelation chapter 5, 9, and 10. See, we have to deal with the problems also. Revelation chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. Do you know that traditionally within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the idea is that the 24 elders represent those who resurrected with Christ? Even the most recent books that you find at the ABC teach that the 24 elders are those who resurrected with Jesus, which we spoke about in our previous lecture. But folks, it's not possible. Because the 24 elders are there in heaven in Revelation 4 before Jesus arrives in chapter 5 with those who were delivered from the grave. Are you understanding me or not? Now, notice Revelation 5, 9, and 10. This is where we have the problem, and we have to solve it. Because this morning, after I presented my sermon or my lecture, I had somebody come out the door and says, but there's this little problem. You said that the 24 elders are the representatives of the worlds, but what do you do with this? And I said, well, come tonight. He says, I can't. So we'll have to get him the DVD. Revelation chapter 5, in verses 9 and 10. It says there, and let's read verse 8 for the context, and when he had taken the book, now notice this, the 4 living creatures and 24 elders. Did you catch this point? The 4 living creatures and the 24 elders, very important point, fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sung a new song. Who was singing this new song? Who was singing the song according to verse 8? The four living creatures and what? The 24 elders. Now, the four living creatures are seraphim. Were they ever redeemed? Were they redeemed from the earth? From every nation, kindred, and tribe? Of course not. I asked that point for a purpose. Notice what we find in verse 9. And they sang a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof. For thou wast slain and hast redeemed, here's the problem, and hast redeemed us to God by the blood, by thy blood, out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation. Doesn't this give the impression that the 24 elders were redeemed from the earth? But the problem is that the living creatures are also singing this song. So were they redeemed from the earth? Of course not. You immediately see that there's a problem here. Notice verse 10. It says, actually the last part of verse 9, For thou wast slain and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign upon the earth. Now, what do we do with that problem? It seems to say that the 24 elders are redeemed from every nation on planet Earth, and it seems to say that they're going to be kings upon the earth. Well, this problem is actually not as complicated as it seems. You see, there's a problem in translation here. The King James translators mistranslated verses 9 and 10. And by the way, almost every single modern version corrects the problem in translation. Whether it's the NIV, the New English Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, all of the modern versions translate these two verses correctly. You see, the pronoun us is not in the original. It's added by the King James translators. And for some unexplainable reason, in verse 10, in Greek, it says, they shall reign upon the earth, and they took the liberty of changing it to we shall reign upon the earth. I'm not saying that the King James Version is a bad version. What I'm saying is that no version of the Bible is perfect. And if you go to the Greek, in which the New Testament was written, it becomes very clear that the 24 elders were not redeemed from every nation. They're actually singing about the redeemed. The best translation actually says in verse 9, and they sung a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain and hast redeemed to God by thy blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation. See, not us, but you have redeemed people from every sphere of planet Earth. And hast made unto our God kings and priests. You've made kings and priests. Not us, but you've made kings and priests. And then they shall reign upon the earth. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, we've solved the problem in translation. We have a few more things that we need to take a look at as we examine the heavenly council. Sometimes the best way to determine who a group are is by studying who they are not. So let's start disqualifying the different groups that we know of in Scripture that exist in heaven and on earth. Number one, are the 24 elders the same as the four living creatures? What are the four living creatures? They are cherubim and seraphim. So are the 24 elders cherubim and seraphim? No, because in Revelation 4 and 5 they're distinguished. They're two different groups. Are the 24 elders part of the angelic host? So, oh, maybe so. Well, let's go to Revelation chapter 5 and verse 11. Revelation chapter 5 and verse 11. They're not angels. They're not part of the angelic host. Notice very carefully. Revelation chapter 5 and verse 11. It says, And I beheld, and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne, and the living creatures, and the elders. are the angelic hosts distinguished from the elders and from the four living creatures in that verse? Yes. They are not cherubim, seraphim, which are the leaders of angels, and they are not part of the angelic host. They are not angelic beings, in other words. What about those who resurrected with Christ? Maybe they're the ones who resurrected with Jesus. I've already mentioned that that's not possible, because they are already present in the throne room before Jesus arrives with those who resurrected. Are you understanding my point or not? In other words, they're already in heaven before Jesus arrives with those who resurrected with him. Which means that these beings were invited to the reception of Jesus when Jesus should arrive in heaven. Somebody might say, well, Pastor, maybe it's a different name for the unnumbered host of the redeemed. Again, nice try. In Revelation chapter 7 and verse 13, if you go with me there, Revelation chapter 7 and verse 13, we find that the 24 elders are actually distinguished from the great multitude, which no one could number. Revelation chapter 7 and let's read verse 9. It says, after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands. Verse 13, and one of the elders answered, saying unto me, what are these which are arrayed in white robes, and whence came they? Notice one of the elders is asking, who is this great multitude? He's asking John. Would he ask, who is this great multitude, if he was part of the great multitude? Of course not. The 24 elders are distinguished from the great multitude of the redeemed. Someone might say, well, Pastor Bohr, maybe they're the ones that are going to resurrect when Jesus comes, when he comes down with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ will rise. They must be the 24 elders. Won't work. Because the 24 elders were there at the ascension. And God's people will not resurrect until the second coming of Jesus. Somebody might say, well, Pastor Bohr, what about the 144,000? Those who will be alive when Jesus comes. Maybe they're the 144,000 with a different name. Once again, if you read Revelation chapter 14 and verse 3, you'll discover that the elders are distinguished from the 144,000. In other words, these beings are not angels, and they don't fit into any category of human beings. So what are we left with? They must be a different order of being. They're not angelic, and they're not human. By what we've studied, they must be the what? They must be the representatives of the worlds. They must be the atoms of the different realms all across the universe. I'd like to read a passage, a portion of a passage that I read in our previous lecture. This is found in Desire of Ages, page 834. You know, Ellen White caught this long before I did. And there's not very many people that have the same view that I do of the 24 elders, but I believe that we have firm biblical evidence and spirit of prophecy evidence for what I'm presenting. In Desire of Ages, Ellen White says this, speaking about the moment when Jesus arrives into the city, 834. There is the throne, and around it the rainbow of promise. There are cherubim and seraphim. What is that equivalent to in Revelation 4 and 5? What are the cherubim and the seraphim? The four living creatures. That's right. And then there's a period, and then she says this, the commanders of the angel hosts, the sons of God, the representatives of the unfallen worlds are assembled. Do you notice here that she speaks of the sons of God, the representatives of the unfallen worlds? She connects what we studied from Job with the fact that they are representatives. By the way, who would those be in Revelation chapter 4? We have the four living creatures. The 24 elders would be what? The representatives of the worlds. And then Ellen White says this, the heavenly council before which Lucifer had accused God and his son. The representatives of those sinless realms over which Satan had thought to establish his dominion. All are there to welcome the Redeemer. They are eager to celebrate his triumph and to glorify their King. But he waves them back. Not yet. He cannot now receive the coronet of glory and the royal robe. He enters into the presence of his Father. Who is the one seated on the throne? The Father. He's not identified in Revelation chapter 4 and 5 as the Father. It simply says one was seated on the throne. He enters into the presence of his Father. He points to his wounded head, the pierced side, the marred feet. He lifts up his hands, bearing the print of nails. Who is the Lamb as though he had been slain? It's Christ. Do you see all of the symbols Ellen White is interpreting from Revelation chapter 4? Now, if the one seated on the throne is the Father, she clearly identifies him. If the four living creatures are cherubim and seraphim, if the Lamb as though he had been slain is Christ, if the innumerable host that is singing are angels, because she interprets them as angels, must we expect also to find in this passage the identity of the 24 elders? Absolutely. And whom does she say they are? Once again, she says the representatives of the unfallen worlds, the sons of God. She says he points to the tokens of his triumph. He presents to God the wave sheaf, those raised with him as representatives of that great multitude who shall come forth from the grave at his second coming. You know, the interesting thing is that God makes decisions in heaven by consulting his heavenly council. You know, there's an interesting reference in the book Story of Redemption. There Ellen White explains that when Satan, who was Lucifer at that time, was rabble-rousing in heaven, and he was spreading rumors against God and turning the heavenly beings against God, it got to a point where God gathered the heavenly council, which would be the representatives of the worlds and the angels. And he said, this is what's happening. It's being done in an underhanded way, but this is what's being done. What do you suggest we do? And do you know what the council said? Expel him from heaven. The decision to expel Lucifer from heaven was not a unilateral decision by God. It was a decision made by the heavenly council. God works by committee. Isn't that nice? You know, as a pastor, I've learned that I can't make unilateral decisions. I have to have the backing of the board. And so God, before he makes any decision regarding this earth, important decision, he gathers the heavenly council to decide what is going to be done. Now, I need to conclude this, and I want to just mention that the 24 elders are mentioned in 6 chapters of the book of Revelation. The first reference is Revelation 4, and I want you to notice the relationship. The first chapter where the 24 elders are is in chapter 4, and they are praising the one on the throne because he is the creator, because Jesus hasn't arrived yet. They are found in chapter 5. In chapter 5, they are praising, the 24 elders are praising Jesus because he is the Redeemer. So see, they were invited there before Jesus ascended. They're there for the celebration when Jesus arrives to welcome the commander home. But you know, there are 4 other places in Revelation where the 24 elders are mentioned, and I'm just going to mention them very quickly. Revelation 7 and verse 13, which we read, where the great multitude without number is found in front of the throne of God. In other words, they've been redeemed. They're in heaven. Are we going to meet the 24 elders someday? Are we going to meet the representatives of the worlds? Yes, because when the great multitude is there, the elders are there. The next place where it's found is Revelation 11, verses 16 and 17. We don't have time to read all these verses. But in Revelation 11, 16 and 17, once again, it speaks about the moment when Jesus Christ receives his kingdom at the end of time. And present there, once again, are the 24 elders. They're also mentioned in Revelation 14 and verse 3. In Revelation 14 and verse 3, we find a description of the 144,000. They're standing on Mount Zion. They're victorious. They've overcome the beast, his image, and they refuse the mark. And now they're victorious on Mount Zion. And along with them are the 24 elders. The final reference is in Revelation chapter 19. There we find a great multitude in heaven. By the way, the Lamb is there. The 4 living creatures are there. There's one who is seated on the throne. All of the beings mentioned in Revelation 4 and 5 are there. And they're singing a song in honor of God. Because no longer is he the creator only, not the redeemer only, but he has judged the great harlot who persecuted God's people. And he's delivered God's people from their enemies. And now they stand in heaven victorious, along with the 24 elders, singing praises to the one who is sitting on the throne. The good news is that very soon we're going to meet the 24 elders. Isn't this good news? We'll be able to meet the beings from other worlds. Some people are bent out of shape because Ellen White says that she once spoke to someone from a different world. It shouldn't bend you out of shape, because we find in Revelation 7 that John is speaking to one of the elders. Isn't God wonderful? Praise the Lord.